Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today and spending an hour with us. Today's presentation is the Solar in the Southeast Annual Report webinar. If you haven't already, you can find the webinar at cleanenergy.org/solar. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started with the presentation. This is a Zoom webinar and it will be recorded, so you will receive a recording to the webinar following the presentation. In addition, if you have questions during the webinar, you can look at the bottom of your screen and there is a question and answer box. So go ahead and submit questions that way. If you're a reporter with a publication, we ask that you please denote which publication you are with so we can make sure to answer that. We do have a lot of participants on today's webinar, so if we do not get to all of the questions, it may be answered in a subsequent blog, or we may follow up with you directly. If you have any technical difficulties during the Zoom webinar, please hit the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send a message to all panelists. So I want to start off by saying that I'm Kate Tracy with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and if we could switch to the next slide. And the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, if you're unfamiliar, it's a regional membership organization that promotes responsible energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. If you're a member of SACE, we'd like to acknowledge you and thank you for becoming a member. If you would like to become a member, you can go to cleanenergy.org. On today's presentation, we will have report author Bryan Jacob, who will be leading the presentation, but to start us off, Dr. Stephen A. Smith, Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, will lead us off. So over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you everybody for taking time out of your busy day to join us. We're excited to present the third annual Solar in the Southeast report. This is these are unprecedented times. It kind of goes without saying, and lots of things are happening. But the continued march towards clean energy, particularly clean solar power, which is the dominant renewable resource in our region, is critically important. And we believe that this report, we've attempted to make it both useful in providing lots of very detailed and quantified information, as well as interesting in the sense that it creates some awareness about how the different players in this space in the utility world, and then looking at it also by geographic states, measure up. We tend to use the watts per customer metric, which is a kind of a great levelizer between both very large utilities and actually smaller utilities, because it is able to levelize across different sizes. And it's a great way to distinguish leaders from laggards. And so you're actually going to hear us talk a little bit about where we're seeing real leadership. And then we're also going to point out where those who seem to be falling behind or unable to sort of get their act together to really take advantage of this resource, both from the tremendous benefits it has for clean energy, but then also for economic development. Bryan's going to go into all the details, but there are a couple of just sort of high-level things that we're going to touch on that I think is very important. Some trends that are manifesting that are quite exciting. First, when we're kind of looking at the watts per customer basis, actually South Carolina is going to surpass the current leader, North Carolina, in the near future. This will likely happen next year. This is a result of work that a number of advocates across the region, a lot of organizations participated in this. We were one of the participants in the Energy Freedom Act, a really classic piece of legislation. And you're going to hear Bryan talk a little bit about both legislative initiatives, regulatory initiatives, and both legislative policy initiatives and legislative and regulatory policy initiatives, which are both moving the needle. And then you're also going to hear about utility leadership. And so all those things come into play, and the Energy Freedom Act was a really prime example of the legislative leadership in South Carolina. Similarly, we're about to see something that we're really surprised to see, because North Carolina has been such a clear leader for a number of years in the Southeast, number 2 in the country. Florida now has accelerated their pace of development, and they will actually pass North Carolina in total installed capacity in megawatts over the next year. And that is actually coming a little earlier than we had originally projected. And this is in large part because the Florida utilities are really rapidly scaling up and beginning to sort of live up to the moniker of the Sunshine State. And one in particular, FP&L, came out with a very innovative program for a community solar program called Solar Together. And we and some other partners were very supportive of that program. And it got regulatory approval through the Florida Public Service Commission. And it has actually compressed or accelerated the time. And we'll get into that a little bit. And again, we want to say that these things just don't happen on their own. They're the result of leadership, the result of leadership, legislative leadership, regulatory leadership, or the utilities themselves doing that. And finally, the reason we sort of are drawing some of these distinctions is, you know, in the Southeast, we really pride ourselves in the intercollegiate sports where there's a lot of competition, either in the Southeastern Conference or the ACC, you know, between whether it be football or basketball or whatever. And so we actually believe that it would be appropriate for folks to really get behind seeing their states and their utilities stepping up to the plate and providing this leadership. I mean, I need not remind you that this past weekend in Siberia, they actually had a day where the temperature in Siberia exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is absolutely insane, shows the urgency that we need to do to address some of these issues. And so beyond just the fact that this is a great technology that brings a lot of benefits to the grid, the economic development opportunities, underlying it all is that this is clean energy, which we are strong advocates for. And this is the technology in the Southeast that is going to dominate the clean energy space in the renewable space going forward. So the other thing that I want to emphasize is that we are going to, again, point out the leadership, but we're also going to call out those who are laggards and those who are either putting out misinformation or they're overselling what they're doing. And so you'll hear us point some of that out, because we believe that in this day and age, facts matter and quantitative facts are particularly important. So with that, let me thank the team that has put a lot of work on this. Bryan primarily is the lead author, you know, Kate and Heather and Kyle, who have all been working together to pull this together. And at SACE, we're very proud to do this. So with that, I'm honored to turn it over to Bryan and let him lead you through their findings.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Kate, and everyone else that contributed to this. And thanks to everybody that has joined us today. I'm kind of intimidated by the interest in this and how many people we have on the webinar. Some of you I know have actually been with us on all 3 of our Solar in the Southeast report launches. And those of you that have been with us that long may actually realize that we're releasing this report later in the year than we had the previous versions. We actually think it's much better to release a solar report in the summer. So we made a conscious decision to wait until after the summer solstice, which was just this last weekend. Summer solstice, longest number of daylight hours in the Northern Hemisphere. So all other things being equal, that should be the day when we have the peak generation from all the installed solar in the Southeast. So we think there's a good kind of time sensitivity there, and are happy to adopt this new reporting schedule. I've got 8 slides that I decided I would pull together to emphasize the things that I think are the most interesting observations in the report. It's actually chock full of lots of things. So I do want to make sure that I get through these quickly and then turn the floor over to the questions, and that way we can see which parts of the report you'd like me to go into more detail on. One of the things that I like best about working for SACE is that we're a science-based, data-driven organization, and that very often means numbers. So this report is indeed full of numbers. We cover 7 states of the Southeast, so Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama. And that represents about 400 utilities. In our appendix of the report, they're all individually listed there. Collectively, they serve right at 30 million customers in those 7 southeastern states. And our data set now for the 2019 base year that we're reporting on has grown to more than 800 utility scale projects. That's not even counting all the distributed solar, residential and commercial rooftop that's in there as well. And one of the things that we said in our very first report, so 2 iterations ago, was that by 2019, the Southeast would have 10 gigawatts of solar, 10,000 megawatts. And the reality is we delivered on that. So by the end of 2019, installed capacity was in excess of 10 gigawatts. The reason we report slightly less than that, this 9,622 megawatts, that's on a full year operational equivalent basis. And that's tripped us up a little bit with in the presentation. So I want to take a moment here to try to describe that. Solar projects are being built throughout the year. If we adopted that which was installed on January 1st, we would underreport. If we reported what's installed by December 31st, we'd really be over-reporting. So our process really gives an operational equivalent that more or less represents the average, so kind of the mid-year during the peak solar generation timeframe, and that's how we report both capacity and generation figures. That's somewhat explained in our methods and assumptions page if you want to look at it in more detail, but I wanted to serve that up here to reconcile why we're saying, yes, we achieved the 10 gigawatt milestone, and yet we're reporting this 9622 megawatt full year number in our report. But when you take the 800 solar projects, which represents about a third increase compared to the 2018 report, and the 9622 full year capacity installed, and the 30 million customers, that's how we compute the 325 watts per customer solar Southeast average and solar ratio. And Steve already talked about that being our primary metric for comparison. That's how we identify the leaders and laggards, both at the state level and by individual utilities. So you'll see a lot of discussion about solar watts per customer. We have in each of the reports included a slide or a page that talks about the policies behind the performance. I wanted to bring that toward the front this year. It's still page 12 of the report, but for purposes of this webinar, I wanted to bring it up front because this year in particular, it seems like we did see examples, really good examples of different types of policies, because different policies work successfully in different states. So we have the legislative policy driver in South Carolina now. We have a good example of a regulatory policy driver in Georgia, and utility policies through their own innovation in Florida. Steve touched on them already, but real quickly, the Energy Freedom Act, South Carolina, passed last year unanimously in both chambers, and it's a comprehensive solar package. So it reinstates retail net metering for residential rooftops through the middle of 2021. It creates additional opportunities for utility scale. It creates opportunities for commercial and industrial customers that are interested to do green tariff sleeved PPAs and meet their own needs. It's a sort of omnibus bill. And now that that is factored into our projections for the next 4 years, you see the watts per customer in this chart here that comes again from page 12, crossing over in 2021, and South Carolina taking the lead over North Carolina on this watts per customer ratio. We saw convergence last year in our report, but it hadn't yet crossed over. So now that next milestone is emerging on this time horizon. The Public Service Commission regulatory leadership in Georgia had to do with the Georgia Power Integrated Resources Plan. Georgia Power files it every 3 years. So 2019, last year, was an IRP year. And they came in proposing 1,000 megawatts of new solar, primarily earmarked for commercial and industrial customers. And through a 6-month proceeding with intervening parties like SACE and others, we demonstrated that there was a cost effectiveness, competitiveness of solar, and that the utility ought to be doing more and not exclusively offering it to the C&I customers, but actually doing more for the entire customer base. And that's how it came out in the final order from the Public Service Commission, ordering the utility to do 2,210 megawatts of solar, so more than double what they originally proposed. And then Steve touched on the Florida Power and Light Solar Together program. That was a unique innovation that they came up with, and did have to get it approved by the Public Service Commission in Florida as well. But when they proposed it, there was a total in the entire United States of 1.3 gigawatts of community solar. And so now that the Solar Together program is approved, it's going to build 1.49 gigawatts of new community solar in the span of the next 2 years. And that is reflected in the Florida bar on this graph as well. Now, the flip side is also true. Whereas good policies can spur additional solar development, poor policies can really stifle the growth of solar. And we see that in some of the markets, particularly those that are under Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. One of the things that we were so disappointed in them doing last year was completely sunsetting the Green Power Providers Program, GPP, that actually had made them a very early leader. And then they systematically kind of made it less attractive and now have done away with it altogether. So that's why you see Tennessee and the other TVA markets kind of lagging behind other states that are moving ahead on watts per customer. This chart is another way to look at this. This is actually in total installed capacity megawatts as opposed to the watts per customer ratio. The reason I call this one out is we had already made a comment last year that Florida would overtake North Carolina in terms of total installed capacity. North Carolina has been the Southeast leader and has been #2 in the country behind California. But we started to see when Florida would overtake North Carolina, and it looked like it was going to be 2022. In this year's report, now that we've updated the forecast with Florida scaling up and some of the North Carolina utilities actually dialing back temporarily, sort of flattening the curve, so to speak, and I can go into that later if you like. But now it looks like Florida is going to overtake North Carolina even a year earlier, so we're showing it in 2021. We always like to call out our sunrisers. Those are the 7 utilities that exhibit the highest ambition across our 4-year time horizon. So base year 2019, forward forecast to 2023, the 7 utilities that exhibit the biggest increase in that watts per customer ratio make this list. Walton EMC was at top of it last year when they commissioned some initial projects for Facebook. They've since commissioned additional projects for Facebook and maintained that #1 slot. The really interesting part to me is Gulf Power emerged onto this list out of nowhere. And it's a real result of the acquisition by NextEra, the same parent company of FPL. And this year, for the first time, they submitted a combined 10-year site plan. That's sort of like an IRP in Florida. The utilities submit them to the Public Service Commission every year. And so Gulf Power has always done one and FPL has always done one. This year they put them together. And what became obvious is that that combined utility has an interest in temporarily shifting some of the focus of their solar build out into the panhandle of Florida where Gulf Power is. So there will be a little bit less activity in peninsular Florida for this time period of the next 4 years, notwithstanding the FPL Solar Together program that I mentioned for the next 2 years. That will actually accelerate mostly in the peninsula. The other thing that I would mention here before I move on is 2 years ago, Georgia Power was on the Sunriser list, just like they are now. But what qualified to get onto the Sunriser list then was an increase in watts per customer ambition of 430 watts per customer. This year, Georgia Power, largely because of the new IRP influenced by the Public Service Commission, their increase over the next 4 years is going to be 902. So it took twice as much ambition to make the cut this year as it did just 2 years ago. So I think that's sort of a rising tide floats all boats sort of phenomenon. There are a lot of utilities raising the bar. So when we call out leaders and laggards, we call the laggards the sun blockers. And sometimes this takes a little bit of an explanation. This is our large utility system ranking. So each of these utilities serves more than 500,000 customers. And we distinguish the sun blockers as the ones that are forecasting 4 years from now to be even below the current Southeast average. Because if you're aiming 4 years from now at today's average, you're aiming way too low. And that's not the kind of leadership that we would expect. We really think that those sun blockers should learn from the sun risers and adopt some of the more ambitious policies. The three that met this designation this year were the Tennessee Valley Authority, Seminole Electric in Florida, and the North Carolina Electric Cooperatives. If we look at the top of these same lists, you can distinguish some that are leaders. Tampa Electric is fulfilling a prior commitment that they had already made to build 600 megawatts of solar by 2021. They've made huge progress on that and have since announced a doubling, so another 600 megawatts by 2023. That is what kind of propels them even higher on the 2023 list on the right-hand side of the screen. We've talked already about the Florida Power and Light Solar Together program, but I think it definitely deserves recognition. That's what's moving Florida Power and Light up the list. And we sometimes forget to acknowledge Duke Energy Progress. They have been at the top of both of these lists on all three of our reports so far. So the current year and the forward-looking 4-year forecast in the first edition, the second edition, and now the third edition of this annual report. So that consistency of leadership, I think, is worth mentioning with Duke Energy Progress. Last thing that I want to mention is how we've achieved some milestones. I mentioned one already, and then a couple that are actually now emerging on the horizon. So we talked about the fact that the Southeast does have the 10,000 megawatts or 10 gigawatts of installed solar capacity now. Our forecasts have continued to increase. So if I look back at that first report from 2 years ago, we were saying 10,000 in 2019 and 15,000 megawatts in 2021. But if you look now, our 2021 number isn't 15 gigawatts, it's more than 17 gigawatts. So our forward forecast has continued to increase in its steepness. And we're now projecting that we will double again from where we are now or where we were in 2019 by 2022. So we'll exceed the 20 gigawatt mark in that year, followed by almost 25 gigawatts in 2023. What's most important there, and I wanted to call it out with some of the fine print here, that's the year where we are first expecting the Southeast to have more than 10% of its total capacity from solar and more than 5% of its total generation from solar. So those are huge milestones that we see now emerging over the horizon, and we're going to keep our eyes on those for subsequent reports. Now, I have told you the things that I think were the most interesting observations in the report, but I suspect that you have questions about different topics. So Kate, have you seen questions come in that you want to float my way?
Yes, we have seen quite a few questions, and just a reminder to everyone to please submit using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you're with a publication or reporter, then just let us know in your question who you are with. But let's lead us off in the questions with Bill Newton. He asks, it looks like utility versus distributed utility is the vast majority. Distributed is the best for consumers, is it not? Because consumers would get lots of savings. What can we do to get more distributed solar?
Great question. And I've got other slides in here, so I'll jump around as I think might be helpful to put something on the screen as part of the answer. you're absolutely right that utility scale dominates. It varies a little bit from state to state. Some states have a little more distributed solar than others, but by and large, it's about 7 out of every 8 megawatts is utility scale and 1/8 distributed solar. I don't know that I can say that distributed solar in all circumstances benefits customers more. That could be a bit of a judgment call. There are lots of reasons why people can't or might not want to do, say, residential rooftop on their own roofs. If, for example, you don't own your home, you lease, or you live in a multi-tenant building, or even if you own it, you have shading and it wouldn't generate as much as it might if it was installed on someone else's home, or if the orientation of your roof is not right, or if you have covenants in your homeowners association that forbid it. There's lots of different reasons like that. So that's why I'm fascinated by some of these larger community solar programs, subscription models that are a bit of a hybrid between the economic advantage of the larger utility scale programs, but in an opt-in voluntary type of model. I actually participated in one myself that my EMC here in Georgia, Sony EMC offers. So my panels are not on my roof. My panels are down in Hazelhurst, Georgia. And you'd ask what we can do to incentivize more. There are programs for incentivizing in certain jurisdictions. I had a conversation earlier today about the fact that there's still a rebate program in North Carolina with the investor-owned utilities, but it is every year oversubscribed, and it's almost the luck of the draw whether you get to take advantage of that rebate program.
Yeah, Bryan, let me add in here to sort of add a little more color for Bill. You know, we as an organization at SACE actually want to see all these market segments moving forward. We don't have a strong preference. You know, the main thing is to get as much solar on the ground as quickly as possible, in our opinion. And so, as Bryan mentioned, there are advantages and disadvantages for each of the sort of large utility scale. Obviously, it's got some very attractive price points, can come in very large numbers and on you know, in ways that actually can be precisionally placed in certain areas that can sort of bring maximum value sometimes for what the utility wants to do. And then obviously the community solars is critically important and has all the advantages of being able to give people options where they may not have options to own. And then as someone who has solar on my house and someone who's a very strong supporter of distributed solar or customer-owned solar on the rooftops, that's critically important. And you see in these yellow bars on the top of the blue bars how that continues to grow. And the policies really matter, but we have a huge variation in the states. Like Florida has a pretty progressive net metering policy, and it's giving a fair payout to customers who are actually supplying power back to the grid. And then you have other areas that have, you know, I mean, TVA is a prime example. They've absolutely put their thumb on the customer-owned solar and pretty much choked that market off to where a lot of businesses have gone out of, a lot of people have gone out of business who were trying to work that market where they were a leader before. And so these policies do matter. And so I think we've got to constantly be looking at making sure that the utilities are not favoring one of the over the other, and that they are providing options for all three market segments to grow and flourish.
Okay, great, Bryan and Steve. Thank you for answering that. And thanks, Bill, for asking that. Can you all talk about the low income aspects of certain programs that are offered around the state that people who may not typically be able to purchase distributed solar might be able to opt into?
Is there a particular state in mind?
No particular state in mind. This is a question that we've received from multiple participants. Maybe some leaders, some examples of leadership.
So I tell you what, hearkening back to our conversation about the FPL Solar Together program, before it got approved by the Public Service Commission, this was one of the sticking points, was that it didn't really have an opportunity for low income participation. And so we and a few others worked with the utility to create a carve out for low income customers that would allow them to participate. And I don't really want to spend a lot of time on the economics of how FPL Solar Together works, but for general participation, there's a little bit of a premium up front, and you become whole by year 7. And then if you stay enrolled in the program, you kind of actually save money while participating in it. The way that the hybrid model for qualified low-income participants allows them to benefit from the very first month of participation. So it is actually an economic advantage to low-income participants to enroll in that program, and they get the benefit of the cleaner supply at a lower price point. So I think it's a brilliant type of compromise position.
Okay, thank you. This question is coming from Frank. He asks, what's the #1 opportunity in the coming year to increase solar in the Southeast? And what is the most effective thing we can do to encourage that to happen?
Well, what immediately comes to mind for me is all source procurement. I mentioned the 10-year site plans in Florida. I mentioned integrated resources plans that a lot of the regulated investor-owned utilities have to undergo. And there are various timeframes. In Georgia, it's every 3 years. In North Carolina, it's every 2, but then they do an update on the intermediate years. And in each of those proceedings, we have started pushing for all source procurement. One of our former colleagues who used to co-author this report with me, John Wilson, he just wrote a report with some other authors for us on this subject earlier this year. He and I testified together in the Georgia Power IRP last year about the advantages of this and how it was employed in Colorado to actually prevent some of their fossil fuel development and instead replace it with clean energy resources. It's basically allowing clean energy resources to compete head to head with the traditional fossil fuel generation resources and allow the models to select from an economic standpoint what the best resource portfolio is. We're making some incremental progress in these proceedings in the Southeast, but I think that would be an even more effective solution for getting more solar than trying to just bolt it on at the end, which is historically how these things have been done.
Yeah, and we can actually include a link to that report in the follow-up to the webinar. It is listed on our website.
Yeah, and Kate, let me jump in here.
Sure.
I think that I don't want to get too political here, but I just think it has to be stated. Putting a price on carbon is an absolutely critical failure. The fact that we don't have a price on carbon is a market failure right now, because there is just all this undeniable scientific evidence that greenhouse gases are forcing climate change and climate disaster and climate disruption. And so the fact that there is not a price hardwired in to the decisions that utilities are making about energy and the fuel associated with energy is, in my opinion, is an absolute crime for both the present and future generations. We've got to tackle that issue. We've got to get that, because that number has got to be in this equation. And I think if that number was in the equation, I think you would see some of this heavy favoritism towards fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, begin to be dealt with in a more appropriate way. So we cannot continue going forward to just dump carbon in an unregulated fashion into the atmosphere. And you know, we all are going to have a chance to have our voice heard in the coming months. And I just strongly believe that that's something no matter where you are in the political spectrum, you've got to see the logic and the rationale for bringing that into the overall equation, because it's just an absolute market failure.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So our next question is from Ellen Myers. She's with S&P Global Market Intelligence. And she asks, what are some ongoing regulatory and/or legislative matters across the Southeast that you're keeping your eye on that could help or hurt solar expansion?
All right, well, let me start by zooming out even to the federal level. We joined forces with a number of other Southeastern organizations and filed comments in the FERC docket with the NERA challenge on net metering. So that hopefully will be dismissed, and then we can leave the power to regulate rooftop markets to the state regulators as we think it ought to be. So I think that's one thing that we're keeping an eye on, because we don't think that the federal government should usurp the authority of the states in that particular case. We're also looking, for example, at other utilities that might follow the lead of FPL with that Solar Together shared solar program. We know that at least one other utility is looking to do something similar, and that might create a new option for additional solar in the Florida market. We didn't talk about this yet, but it's in the report. There are bad policies in some states with regard to rooftop solar as well. We did talk about TVA sunsetting the GPP program, but we didn't talk about the fact that Alabama Power has a punitive solar surcharge for residential rooftop solar. So we're also eagerly watching how that plays out, and would like to see more leadership like we have in Georgia, where in the Georgia Power territory, we're actually getting true retail net metering for the first time, just starting now as a result of last year's rate case. And it's just a pilot test, and it's limited to 5,000 customers or 32 megawatts, but it's a start. So there's kind of a good and bad example there, sister organizations within the same Southern Company umbrella.
Yeah, and I would add, we've done this dance a little bit with some of the utilities, and it really hasn't been, I think, an honest engagement. But we believe that, and I notice there's another question coming up about, threats to net metering, and we see that because there is that market segment where customer-owned solar the economics are built around getting a fair price if they sell it back to the grid. And the definition of fair, obviously to some degree, is in the eyes of the beholder, but doing a honest and true evaluation of the value of solar and all of the plethora of benefits that it brings to the grid is critically important if they're, as we're thinking about how customer-owned solar plays a part. We've seen, we did an exercise with TVA, and it never really ended up in a good place. And then they ended up taking their number below retail, which has just absolutely killed the market in Tennessee. We see other, like Alabama and other places that are trying to discourage this market segment. And so it is a real threat. And again, Florida has a very vibrant, and you see, if you see the bars on top of, maybe Bryan, you can go back to that states, you can see which states, based on the yellow bars on top of the blue, are showing the most amount of customer-owned, or what, some people call it distributed. I mean, there's different ways that you can, sort of define it, but basically you see where the customer-owned stuff versus the big utility stuff. And you can see that Florida just is way ahead of the other southeastern states and going forward in having that. And, if there was a full-throated attack on net metering, I think it would be a very nasty kind of fight, because we have not seen an honest engagement really from many of the Southeastern utilities to properly value what this distributed resource can bring to their systems. They tend to have a lot of institutional bias to minimize these ancillary values and these other things. So this is something that we're constantly tracking and aware of. It's not the #1 driver for overall solar, but it really is one of the ones that give people their closest interaction with solar, and it creates a very broad, popular, and even political support when people are able to see and experience solar firsthand and up close. And so it's built a lot of solar champions and a lot of solar awareness. And so I think it would be a horrible mistake for the utilities to continue to try to keep their finger on, their thumb on the scales here and try to keep this suppressed, because as the prices continue to come down, as we start seeing more opportunities with storage, including opportunities where you may be integrating the solar on your house with your electric car and doing vehicle to grid interactions and all these other kind of things, there's lots of innovation now that is being opened up in this space. And we need the utilities to be full partners in that, instead of trying to sort of, again, put their finger on the thumb and try to discourage innovation to some sort of, self-serving advantage.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And just to let everyone know, a time check, we have about 15 minutes left of the webinar, and we are getting a lot of great questions in. So we will either follow up directly or your question might be answered in a subsequent blog. This next question comes from Richard. He's asking, what utilities, and in particular, is FPL attacking or planning to attack net metering at retail?
Yeah, I don't know where that question necessarily came from, or what it's intended to imply. There is potentially an argument that by setting up the economics of the Solar Together program, that it might compete with the rooftop market. But like Steve said earlier, we, as an organization, we want to see all the different market segments of solar succeed together. And I think that this shared solar type of opportunity does provide an additional option for people who otherwise can't or don't want to put solar on their rooftops. So I don't really see them in direct conflict with one another. And I have not seen any maneuvers from them to attack net metering at its statutory or regulatory basis either.
Yeah, let me put a finer point on that. I have actually directly engaged with several of the Southeast, the Florida utilities about this question. Some of us have. I think the proper way to respond to this is solar advocates need to be ever vigilant. We have asked in a very direct way, and we've encouraged that if there is going to be a debate about net metering, that it should be done well in advance of trying to sort of slide something through. And there should be, if there are changes that need to be made based on some concern the utilities have, that should be properly and publicly discussed, and no shenanigans. We, any of you who know the history in Florida know that we've had battles with the big utilities in the past. And I think right now there is at least sort of some common ground, and there's some common growth, and you can see the benefits of this, where the utilities are providing leadership as opposed to being, laggards. And I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. If solar together can discourage people to put solar on their house because FP&L is offering a better deal through that program, more power to them. I think they have the absolute right to go into the marketplace and give customers the best possible option to provide solar in the way that they want. It's when they start to proactively and affirmatively discourage net metering that I think they start to cross the line. We are not seeing significant levels of that now. There's always chatter about people who are, trying to get systems on and this, that, and the other, but it does not seem to be a systematic approach. And I think FPNL has indicated to us that that's not their current policy. But it's no secret that some utilities continue to have this perspective that customer-owned solar is not to their advantage, and they try to come up with these arguments about how it's unfair to other customers and cross-subsidization, all this kind of what we think is misleading arguments. So my response to anybody who's a champion for net metering is you have to be ever vigilant. We are as an organization, and I think we have to continue to say, let all flowers bloom in the solar space. Let's get as much of it on the ground because we need as much of this clean power. And, again, at my age, the only thing that happens every day of my life that is absolutely consistent, the sun comes up in the east and it sets in the west. It's never changed. It's always happened. We can count on it. And we should actually take absolute advantage of that every single minute of the day that it's shining.
All right, thanks, Steve. I agree with you. It does do that every day. Okay, this question is from Carlos. He asks, TVA just announced this week that they're going to allow LPCs to install 5% of their own generation, install 5% of their own generation of their annual energy demand. Has that been factored into your forecast curve?
Thank you. Yeah, in fact, it caused me to have to make some last minute edits. And if you look at the Tennessee State profile, you'll see, because I had a reference in there to Memphis Light, Gas, and Water. And up until 2 days ago, the amount of solar that TVA would allow MLGW to develop on their own was only going to be 81 megawatts. And then when they made their last minute course correction change, that went up to 202 megawatts. So I had to tweak that in the narrative. Did not have time to change anything in the forecast, but frankly, it wouldn't change the forecast anyway, or it's rather unlikely to change the forecast. It remains to be seen how the individual LPCs that take advantage of that would deploy it. How much would be distributed versus utility scale, for example. And the other thing that I would point out with regard to the question is that, yes, TVA is making the statement that the LPCs would be allowed to develop up to 5%, but we have pointed out already that the way they do the math, even with the most recent change, does not really result in an LPC being allowed to do a full 5% of their own power generation. The old math would have gotten them to about 1%. The new math gets them to about 3%, which TVA takes satisfaction in because their original wording was between 3 and 5%. Well, they constructed this to come in at the very low end of that range. You can't build solar and expect to be generating 5% the way they're defining it. So it's a little bit misleading, which is actually not very unusual for TVA. They've got a lot of misleading claims that they make.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Let's shift focus over to North Carolina. This question is from Will. He asks, if Duke Energy Progress is leading in solar, why is North Carolina falling behind?
Well, I don't think it's fair to represent them as falling behind. I mean, North Carolina is still doing a lot. And it is mostly the Duke affiliates in North Carolina that are leading the charge. What really happened, I kind of mentioned that they do their IRP every 2 years. This year is a full IRP year again, but last year they did an update. And so when we put the 2019 forecast into our model, it reduced the solar build out from the 2018 forecast. Not in the long term. So if you look at their entire IRP forecast, it's actually going up, but it's going up later in the decade. And we're only looking at this 4-year forecast window. So I had used the term earlier today, flattening the curve, which we've all become accustomed to in terms of coronavirus. It's sort of like that. Over the next 4-year period, they're going to be doing about 600 to 700 megawatts less than they originally had planned. But then in the latter part of the decade, they're going to be 600 or 700 megawatts more than they had planned. So it'll catch up, and the total amount is actually going to be even higher than it otherwise would have been, just a little bit less in this next 4-year period.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And shifting focus over to South Carolina, this question is from Ellie. She asks, we have a number of cooperatives in South Carolina, some of which discourage distributive power installation. What can be done?
Well, the good news about cooperatives, and I belong to one as well, is that you're a member, and they have annual meetings, and you can go in there and you can vote. And it's not like a board of directors or even a public service commission, public utilities commission, helping to influence an investor-owned utility. You have a vote directly in the decisions of the EMC. So it's a complicated process, but you do have that authority. I would say that even though the EMCs in general have been kind of late to the game in a lot of states, we're starting to see more leadership. Here in Georgia, the EMCs are really stepping up in a major way. I mentioned in our Sunrisers, I can actually show that slide. It's actually one of the EMCs that is right there at the top, Walton EMC. So maybe us doing things like this report and showcasing good policy versus bad policy. You're welcome to make sure that your EMC leadership gets a copy of the report and try to encourage them to do more, to offer opportunities, or at least let them know that you're interested in both distributed solar and then them also putting more into their own portfolio. I'd say those are probably a few first steps you could take.
Okay, thanks, Brian. This next question is coming from Art. He asks, can you tell us more about any developments on energy storage and incentive considerations to promote this, if any? And this question actually came from a few of our participants today.
We are not putting energy storage in our report yet, but we're starting to get the feed into our database because it is picked up in the same Energy Information Administration, EIA, reports that we download as one of our main data sets that, or data feeds that goes into our model. So we're recording information about storage, both utility scale storage and then also behind the meter storage. And we're trying to figure out really where it plays. If I had to kind of speculate with my crystal ball, where we're seeing it mostly is in states that need it more from a resilience standpoint. So a lot of the Florida locations are starting to put behind the meter solar along with behind the meter storage with rooftop solar. And South Carolina, it's starting to make a difference there as well. And actually, we've heard from some of the solar crowdsource projects here in Georgia that a large percentage of those are starting to specify storage with their solar installations too. But one of the things that's interesting to note is that from an economic standpoint, if you have retail net metering, then the storage addition is less valuable because you don't need to store it behind the meter in order to get full retail value of it. You're kind of, to a certain extent, using the grid as your storage if you're getting full retail credit for it. So storage has more benefit individually to your economics if you're in a market that does not have one-to-one retail net metering. One last point that I would make, there's a very interesting model that I'm trying to watch and have seen some interest expressed from the municipal utilities in Florida that are also taking a look at it, with Green Mountain Power up in, I guess it's Vermont, where they are incentivizing behind the meter storage, residential storage, but in return for the utility being able to draw from it when necessary, sort of like I have a switch on my air conditioner and my utility can cycle my air conditioner off during peak periods, but I can't push power back to them. If you had residential storage and they wanted to pull power back during peak periods, that could be a serious benefit to the grid for reliability purposes. So I think those are all interesting things that we're going to watch and maybe see in the coming years.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I think we have time for just one or two more questions. This is coming from Robert. He asks, what can or is being done to promote commercial or industrial distributed generation segment?
Okay, thanks. So the C&I sector has been expressing more and more interest in renewable energy in general. Things like the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, the RE100 program. So you've got corporate entities making commitments that need to be fulfilled, and they could be fulfilled with on-site solar, or they could also enroll in some of these voluntary shared solar type programs. So I hate to keep going back to the Florida Power and Light Shared Solar Program, but Solar Together program, as it's called, that the large C&I customers can participate in that just like a residential customer can, or a municipal government customer as well. You've got things like the Green Source Advantage program that was created for this purpose in North Carolina. There's a similar thing in the Energy Freedom Act for South Carolina to allow the C&I customers to do deals with developers and then transact it through the utility. So it's some in the industry they sometimes call it a sleeved PPA. So it's a power purchase agreement sleeved through the utility. Here in Georgia, as part of that IRP that I mentioned with Georgia Power, the 1,000 megawatts that they came in proposing, they got that and more in what's called the CRISP program, the Corporate Renewable Supply Procurement. And it is specifically to fulfill the expectations of that C&I community that wants more solar than had been previously offered to them. So there's lots of different options being created.
Okay, and we have time for one more question. This is coming in from, this is coming in from Dan. He says, who will regulate the rooftop solar market for Memphis should they initiate the 5-year exit plan from TVA?
Interesting question. I believe I know the answer, and Steve or anybody else, you can make sure and keep me honest here. Right now, because Memphis is supplied by TVA, TVA is the regulator for them. TVA is self-regulated, so they don't have state oversight. They're a federal entity. And their board, the TVA board, actually serves as the regulatory authority for all the local power companies. If Memphis leaves and becomes independent and sources their power through a relationship, in part from self-generation locally, 1,000 megawatts locally, and then the rest through a connection into MISO, I believe it would be the Tennessee Public Service Commission that would be the regulator over them at that point.
Well, it's a good question, because currently the only area that I'm aware of in Tennessee is up in Kingsport, where you have the Eastman Chemical Company served by, I think, AEP. And so there is some regulatory engagement by the Tennessee Regulatory Authority. But given that Memphis is a public power entity, and even if they leave TVA, MLG&W will still be a public power entity, it's not clear to me that the Tennessee Regulatory Agency would have the same oversight as as it does, say, with AEP, and the fact that they're a private power company coming in. So it's a fascinating question. I'm not sure that you may have stumped us, because I'm not sure we absolutely do have the right answer. My response to that would be that that MLG&W would be largely the one responsible for the systems that their customers are putting on their rooftop, and so there wouldn't be a state regulatory entity over that, given that they're public. But I may be wrong, but and this may, given that if I'm not mistaken, because of the way that TVA had sort of cannibalized all the private power entities over their history in the state before this sort of regulatory mechanism was set up, I don't know that there is authority by the TRA on public power entities in the electric sector. So I think it may only be limited to private power. But that's a fascinating question, and whoever asked it, you've given us some homework, and we'll try to dig into it a little bit.
Yeah, indeed. We'll take that up.
Okay, well, thank you, Bryan and Steve, for presenting today and answering questions. We are going to go ahead and conclude. I just want to remind everyone that this webinar will be recorded, and we will be sending a follow-up email to all participants with a link to the recording, as well as a link to the blog that accompanies the report and the report itself. If you're interested in learning more about solar in the Southeast, you can head to cleanenergy.org/solar, where you will also find a copy of the report. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of your day.